But until we know who the key players are in the Trump administration and frankly on the Hill, it's a little bit difficult to say exactly what specific reforms are going to be sought and how much money will or will not be used as leverage to try to achieve those reforms.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Republicans will soon control the House of Representatives, the United States Senate, and, of course, the White House. So what does this Republican trifecta mean for the United Nations? Peter Yo, Senior Vice President of the United Nations Foundation, explains the nuances of how Republicans have traditionally approached the United States' relationship to the UN and what we can expect from the Trump administration, the Senate, and the House moving forward. The United States is both the host country of the UN and the UN's largest funder. So US-UN relations really do matter profoundly for the functioning of the UN and for the multilateral system more broadly, and there are few people who follow this issue as closely as Peter Yo. I learned a lot from this conversation, and I'm sure you will as well. So I do want to add one programming note. So of course, we will here on Global Dispatches cover all facets of how the Trump administration is impacting American foreign policy and international affairs more broadly, including America's shifting alliances, bilateral relations, its relationship with multilateral institutions. That will be covered in depth and frequently on this podcast. But I do want to emphasize one thing. So I've been doing this show now for almost 12 years. Various administrations, various political cycles. One thing I learned from the last Trump administration is that the space for media to cover things that are not all Trump all of the time really did shrink during that first Trump administration. And frankly, I expect it to shrink as well as media is seized on what the Trump administration will do. That squeezes out other really important stories around the world. And one thing that distinguishes Global Dispatches, distinguishes the work that we've done, that I do, is that I pay attention to those other stories around the world and bring them to you when other media don't. So please expect that going forward. And please help me bring those stories to you by becoming a paid supporter of this show. You can do so on globaldispatches.org and just sign up for a paid subscription. Each individual subscription goes a very, very, very long way to making this show sustainable. So thank you. Now here is my conversation with Peter Yo, Senior Vice President of the United Nations Foundation. So, Peter, I just wanted to kick off by asking you, what you're hearing from your colleagues and contacts around the UN right now. What's been the kind of general reaction to the US election?
My sense is that most senior UN officials, as well as, diplomats stationed in New York and other UN capitals, were fairly closely tracking the political situation here in the United States and the election. And so I'm not sure there was a lot of surprise at the particular outcome. I was in New York last week, and as part of that visit was meeting with several perm reps, and I think they were expecting the possibility of a Trump victory and a Republican victory in Congress. So because they were expecting it, my sense is that there's less of a surprise and probably more built into with the system, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, unlike 2016, this was not like a surprise result. This was a kind of a coin toss of an election going into it according to the polls, and the coin landed, Trump heads up.
Well, yeah, but also, I mean, to be clear, UN officials, unlike Americans, don't go into it with a point of view.
Yeah.
Their job is to be more analytical, to deal with whoever is in power in whatever country. And so when you don't go into the elections with a particular point of view, but rather are just sort of more objectively trying to analyze the situation, it sometimes can lead to perhaps more realistic expectations.
Yeah, I mean, there's like 192 member states, and there are changes in government in all of those countries all the time. So it's not like a huge deal when there's a change in government. But the U.S. is, I would put it this way, first among equals when it comes to the United Nations for the fact that it's the host country, it's the top funder, it's still the key global leader. So I'm curious to learn from you what you might expect from a Trump second administration. One thing that I've been like trying to emphasize is that people who are maybe less in tuned as you or I to US UN relations might think that Trump is somehow like intrinsically hostile to the UN, but he's not. Like we've seen this movie before.
President Trump spent in his previous term spent 4 years very actively engaged at the United Nations. He enjoyed the world stage that was provided by the annual address at the UN General Assembly, funding actually for the UN's humanitarian work, in part because of leadership from Republicans in Congress. But the Trump administration went along with it. Funding for the UN's humanitarian work went up significantly during the Trump administration, and, we saw the Trump administration actively using the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, to really advance their priorities, including on religious freedom and counter narcotics and North Korea. So, I mean, the administration was fairly engaged with the UN system. Now, there were challenges, of course, and we could talk more about that. But I think it's important to remember that it was not sort of a black or white type situation. I think it's fair to say that the Obama administration and the Biden administration had a different approach to the United Nations than President Trump, for sure. But again, it was not a black or white situation. And senior Trump officials and the president himself were pretty engaged at the UN.
So, Peter, because you and I have done this for a long time across administrations of both political parties, there are certain like commonalities that these parties bring when they approach the UN. And for the Republicans, when Republicans come into office, there are certain steps they typically take very initially that pertain to the UN. In particular, every Republican administration since the Reagan administration has sought to defund the UN Population Fund, the UN agency that supports maternal and reproductive health around the world. So I suppose we could probably expect that to happen. Are there any other just like common check the box things that Republicans do and policies that they enact towards the UN that you think just right off the bat we might expect?
As you noted, Republican administrations in general move quickly to remove funding from UNFPA, which is a real shame, frankly, because I've seen firsthand the ability of UNFPA to promote better maternal and child health outcomes. It's really amazing work that UNFPA does. And the decisions to defund UNFPA are related to UNFPA's alleged work in China a couple decades ago, frankly. So it's not necessarily a fact based decision, but UNFPA is certainly one of those early decisions we'll be looking for. Other early possible decisions from a Trump administration are whether they will remove themselves from the Paris Climate Agreement again. Where does WHO stand? The World Health Organization stand in terms of the Trump administration? You'll recall that in the last year of the previous Trump administration, the administration sought to remove the U.S. from the World Health Organization, and certainly probably a continuation of the no funding stance towards UNRWA, which is the UN agency for assisting Palestinians. So as I think about that first week, those are the types of decisions that might be on the table.
So I did want to ask you about the WHO in particular because, unlike say the UN Population Fund, or also you didn't mention it, but I'd probably add disengaging from the UN Human Rights Council, which is like a common Republican position that's like not out of the ordinary of Republican positions at this point. Abandoning the WHO is something that's like somewhat aberrational, right? Like we've never seen any other Republican administration seek to defund or walk out of the World Health Organization. But as you noted, the tail end of the Trump administration did seek to withdraw from WHO related to COVID. They blamed the WHO for, in my view, their own mishandling of COVID. But nonetheless, the Trump administration did seek to withdraw the US from the WHO. I guess I have two questions. Are you able to like weigh the likelihood of that outcome, number one? And number two, like what would be the impact to the WHO should the US seek to withdraw from it?
My sense is, first of all, you mentioned the Human Rights Council. I just want to touch on that briefly. The Biden administration made a decision not to run for another term on the Human Rights Council. So the U.S. is cycling off the Human Rights Council, anyways. The Biden administration made the decision based upon the desire of other countries in Europe to serve a term on HRC. So that one, I think, is a little bit off the table. As it relates to World Health Organization, hard to weigh the chances. I think it's important that the pharmaceutical and other health based industries in the US have an opportunity to weigh in with the incoming Trump administration. WHO sets the global standards that are applicable to a lot of US industry in the pharmaceutical sector. I think that this industry would be reluctant for the US not to have a seat at the table as these key standards and practices are set by WHO. So I wouldn't say that that is a fait accompli that the Trump administration will make that decision to withdraw from WHO, not only because of the role that WHO plays in terms of setting standards that are applicable to the US, but also because of WHO's work around the world to provide a variety of critical health services and cooperation that really redounds well ultimately to global health issues generally, but also to the reputation of the US.
Can you talk to like the impact that would befall the WHO if the US decided to withdraw?
If the US were to obviously withdraw from the World Health Organization, the organization would lose about a quarter of its funding, as well as additional money that's provided by the US for individual projects being advanced by the World Health Organization, including for polio. And the US Centers for Disease Control work very closely with the World Health Organization to ensure that, among other things, that we stop pandemics before they hit the US, that other types of health emergencies are called early, and that the US health system is aware of and coordinated with health systems around the world. Defunding the World Health Organization ends all that and really reduces the ability of the World Health Organization to achieve its mandate. So, US defunding of World Health Organization would be really pretty devastating for US global health security, the ability of Americans to be protected from pandemics. And it would also, of course, be devastating for hundreds of millions of people around the world who really depend upon the World Health Organization to protect them and to advance their health. It would be pretty devastating for the US to not have a seat at the table in Geneva.
So Peter, like big picture, overall, the general like Republican strategy of affecting reforms at the United Nations is to threaten to withhold funding to various parts of the UN or even the UN as a whole until or unless certain reforms are achieved. And generally, when democratic administrations are seeking to affect changes or reform at the UN, they're kind of less willing to dangle the threat of withholding funding. Do you see that dynamic playing out in the next 4 years, particularly as Republicans control Congress as well? And if so, like, are there any specific reforms that Republicans will seek to affect at the UN that they might use the threat of withholding funding to enact?
I think it's too early to say whether the Republicans will once again use funding as a lever to enact reforms at the UN. Because frankly, personnel is policy in Washington and in New York. And until we know who President Trump puts into key positions of power, whether it's ambassador to the UN or secretary of state or national security advisor, it's really difficult to know how the US financial leverage is actually going to play out in terms of reforms. The types of reforms that Republicans have sought in the past primarily relate to greater budget efficacy, transparency at the United Nations, reduced focus on Israel in terms of the human rights and lens, and I think generally the issue about the UN being an effective organization. So as we think about a Republican Congress and a Republican administration, we will likely see an increased focus on the issue of UN reform, including effective management of the UN and greater transparency of the organization. We've seen this in the past. We're certain to see it over the next 4 years. But until we know who the key players are in the Trump administration and frankly on the Hill, it's a little bit difficult to say exactly what specific reforms are going to be sought and how much money will or will not be used as leverage to try to achieve those reforms.
So I'm glad you brought up the Hill. I know you follow Congress as closely as anyone I know, particularly around US UN issues. What do you see as the future of Congress's relationship to the United Nations, particularly one that is now controlled in both houses by Republicans?
Well, I think you have to look at it differently between the House and the Senate. On the Senate side, where Republicans have now taken control from the Democrats and will control the appropriations process, which determines how much money goes to the UN and to UN agencies, funds, and programs each year. That process will now be controlled by Susan Collins, the senator from Maine. Senator Collins visited the UN last year, in fact, to sort of dive deep on how the UN was working to advance the cause of women's rights in Afghanistan. Senator Collins has a reputation of being a sort of a straight shooter, also a key balancer between the right and left, not only within her own caucus in the Senate, but also between the House and the Senate and with Democrats.
That's interesting. And for listeners who are out of the United States, which is about half the audience, it is worth emphasizing that she is just like a dyed in the wool moderate and not certainly a firebrand.
Susan Collins is not a firebrand and fully understands the value of the UN and our investments overseas. It doesn't mean that she's going to agree to everything that needs to get done from a UN perspective, but she is definitely more on the moderate side of the House. And Lindsey Graham is still in a key position in the Senate. And Lindsey Graham fully appreciates the value of the UN in certain instances. Lindsey Graham has been a key player on the State Foreign Ops Subcommittee, which again, that's the particular subcommittee that gives away money to the UN. On the House side, they have been approaching it for the past couple of years with legislation to completely defund the United Nations, including the UN regular budget, which funds sort of the core operations of the UN. The last 2 years, that bill has passed the House of Representatives. So I would expect more of that from the House of Representatives moving forward, and perhaps a more moderate approach from the Senate.
So that's interesting. It's like the key dynamic here is between the House, which, as you noted, passed under Republican control legislation to completely defund the UN regular budget, to which the US contributes about a quarter. But that will have to be sussed out in negotiation with the Senate, in which kind of cooler, more moderate heads have greater power. So that'll be like the key dynamic in terms of budgeting for the United Nations from the US Treasury.
Well, and for sure, but something's really significant has changed as a result of this election. For the past couple of years, when this very extreme bill has been approved by the House of Representatives to completely defund the UN, the attitude among some Republicans in the House was, listen, we don't think this is a great idea to completely defund the UN, but somebody else will fix it. And that somebody else was either a Democratic Senate or a Democratic White House. We have a new dynamic, which is a Republican Senate, a Republican White House, and a Republican House. So it'll be interesting to see how conservative but more practical Republicans in the House and Senate approach this issue now that there's not, quote unquote, somebody to fix it.
Hmm.
And that may change the dynamics within the caucus. Time will tell.
Fascinating. That's something certainly to watch. In the coming, weeks, what are you looking towards that will suggest to you the kind of tact the Trump administration might take towards the UN when it takes office in January?
So much of it is, again, personnel is policy. We're going to be looking for who President Trump is likely to tap for key positions. And it's not just the ambassador to the UN or national security advisor or secretary of state. It's, assistant secretary of state for international organizations. It's whoever's head of the Office of Management and Budget. It's two deputy secretaries of state. There's a whole series of key positions that will have quite an influence over the American role at the United Nations for the next 4 years. That's what we're going to be looking for. The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has already reached out to the president elect. And when President Trump was last in office, the Secretary General and President Trump had a very productive and constructive relationship. President Trump hosted the Secretary General not once, but twice at the White House, including a visit by the UN Security Council. So the relationship between this Secretary General and President Trump in the previous tenure was productive. Again, it didn't mean that they agreed all the time on every issue. They didn't, including on climate change. But it meant that they had a productive relationship, which allows for perhaps some greater room for progress.
So when Democrats are in the White House, the position of U.S. ambassador to the United Nations is almost always a cabinet level position. When Republicans are in the office, it sometimes is and sometimes isn't. When Nikki Haley was U.S. ambassador to the UN, it was a cabinet level position. When Kelly Craft was the ambassador to the UN, it was not a cabinet level position. What difference or significance does it make whether or not that position is in the cabinet, is part of the National Security Council decision making at the highest level?
In general, having the ambassador to the UN in the cabinet is a signal to other world leaders and to officials at the United Nations and to diplomats at the United Nations that this US ambassador is in tight with the president, and that when she speaks for the president, speaks for the US, she's speaking authoritatively. And so if the ambassador is not in the cabinet, there's a potential of officials, interlocutors, other diplomats thinking, yeah, is she really the most important person, or should I go deal with the Secretary of State? But a lot of it depends upon who that person is and whether they are visibly seen and known to have a close relationship with President Trump. And so President Trump could pick somebody to be ambassador to the UN, not put them in the cabinet, but everybody knows that that particular individual has a close relationship with the president, and that might be enough to ensure that the US ambassador to the UN has sufficient power and efficacy. But again, it just sort of depends on who President Trump picks, and that will determine how important it is whether that person's in the cabinet or not.
Well, Peter, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insights, as always.
Anytime, Mark.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.